Raised against the sky like a defiance of nature itself, the castle was born out of boundless ambition. It was not just a shelter, not simply a fortress. It was a monument designed to eternalize a name, a dynasty, an illusion of power that longed to outlast mortality. Every stone placed upon that soil was not mere raw material. It was a symbol, an act of arrogance, a desperate attempt to transform human fragility into eternity. The construction began as a spectacle. Entire populations were summoned to labor without pause, quarrying massive blocks from distant cliffs, dragging them across roads that broke under the weight, pushed by men who were already exhausted before reaching the site. Days were marked by the clang of hammers, the echo of chisels, the barking of overseers. Pain did not matter. Hunger did not matter. The castle had to rise, no matter the cost. The king who envisioned it spoke of the structure as though it were alive. In his delirium, each tower represented his strength, each wall his skin, each stone the reflection of his soul. But while he dreamed of immortality, workers endured a nightmare of flesh and blood. Hundreds perished during the building, crushed by collapsing scaffolds, broken under the weight of slipping blocks, consumed by sickness born from relentless labor. Even before its completion, the castle was already a graveyard. To feed the construction, the kingdom itself was drained. Villagers were stripped of food, wood, iron, and men. What was promised as a fortress of protection became a parasite feeding upon those it was meant to shield. Hunger spread across the land while the monarch, entranced by his rising towers, ignored the corpses piling around him. The promise had been simple. The castle would be a beacon of glory. Its towers would announce to the world that the kingdom was unshakable, eternal. Yet no one admitted, or dared admit, that every stone was cemented with suffering. The dream of stone carried a price, and that price was paid in human lives. Legends say the site seemed cursed from the beginning. Bitter winds swept the ground without cause, carrying sounds like moans. Shadows cast by the towers formed unnatural shapes upon the earth, as if anticipating the dark fate of the structure. Workers swore they heard screams echoing through walls still wet with mortar, as though the agony of the dead had been trapped within the foundation itself. But none of this halted the construction. The more ominous the rumors became, the more convinced the king was that he was creating something beyond human comprehension. He declared that only a monument raised upon blood could resist the passage of time. Death, to him, was not a barrier, but a necessary offering. Every tragedy was recast as a sacrifice. Every life lost transformed into a silent tribute to the fortress that grew ever higher. The dream of stone was never just a building. It was a declaration of war against humanity itself. A place where suffering was the foundation, pain, the mortar, pride, the towers. Born under the promise of glory, the castle carried the weight of tragedy from the very first strike of the hammer. And that mark would never leave it. The castle, once completed, rose like a crown upon the landscape. Its towers pierced the horizon, gleaming in the light of dawn, and its walls stood as if carved from the very bones of the earth. To those who gazed upon it from afar, it seemed the pinnacle of strength and majesty, a fortress destined to stand for eternity. The king declared it a symbol of divine favor, the material proof that his reign was blessed, unshakable, and eternal. Processions filled the courtyards, banquets overflowed with food and wine, and songs proclaimed the glory of the dynasty. But behind the glittering facade of grandeur, shadows lurked. For a while, the castle dazzled the eyes of those who saw it from the outside. Those who lived within its walls knew it differently. They knew the promises of glory were illusions carefully painted over cracks of fear and secrets too dark to be spoken aloud. The great halls were adorned with tapestries, chandeliers, and silver goblets, each detail designed to dazzle foreign envoys and intimidate rivals. Yet the very air of those chambers felt heavy, as though the splendor was less a celebration than a mask. Visitors whispered that they could feel unease pressing against their skin, a strange chill that lingered even by the warmth of roaring fires. Servants crossed those halls with their heads bowed low, as if afraid that the walls themselves were listening. In every feast, where the king raised his goblet in triumph, the laughter of nobles rang hollow. They toasted to glory, but swallowed unease along with their wine. The same stone walls that protected them also trapped them, and the memory of the deaths that had built the castle seemed to echo in every banquet. Food was abundant, but the taste of sacrifice lingered, bitter and unshakable. Luxury was not comfort. It was theater. Every gulen-crusted throne, every golden plate, every silk curtain was a performance meant to convince the world that the king's dream had succeeded. But the truth, felt most keenly by those who dwelled inside, was that the castle demanded obedience and silence. Behind the glitter of wealth, there were secrets. Whispers of curses, of unnatural deaths, of alliances sealed not with trust but with fear. The king himself became obsessed with appearances. He paraded through his halls in garments woven with gold thread, his crown heavy with jewels ripped from the earth, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Yet, in private, he grew restless, prowling the corridors at night, convinced that enemies lurked within. His obsession with projecting glory revealed the shadow that consumed him. Paranoia. The castle that was meant to shield him from all dangers had become the stage for his growing fears. Servants told stories in hushed voices of rooms that seemed colder than others. Chambers where fires refused to burn brightly and shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Guards swore they heard footsteps in empty corridors, whispers rising from staircases where no one stood. Some claimed the castle itself breathed, the groan of its stones at night, like the sighs of the dead buried in its foundation. For the nobles, life within the castle was not the paradise they had been promised. The luxuries meant to dazzle them were suffocating, for every banquet was also a performance of loyalty. A missed toast, a delayed bow, or even a glance, interpreted the wrong way, could be seen as disloyalty. The gilded halls became traps, where every noble played a role in the endless theater of obedience. Few dared to speak their minds. Fewer still survived when suspicion fell upon them. The castle's very architecture seemed designed not to protect, but to dominate. Towers loomed over courtyards like watchful eyes. Windows were narrow, letting in light but offering little escape. The vastness of the halls, meant to inspire all, instead crushed the spirit, leaving those who stood within feeling small and powerless. What was proclaimed as luxury was in truth a prison crafted from stone and gold. Even the king's private chambers, adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of victory and prosperity, could not escape the shadows. Behind the silks and perfumes, the air felt heavy with dread. Those who served him whispered that he could rarely sleep, pacing the floors in the dead of night, his mind tormented by visions of betrayal. He had built a monument to immortality, yet he himself was haunted by mortality at every turn. The luxury of the castle came at a cost so high it could not be concealed. The kingdom beyond its walls starved under the weight of the project. Fields were abandoned, villages drained of supplies, while the castle feasted on the lifeblood of the people. The banquets of the nobility were spectacles of excess, but the suffering outside the gates whispered louder than the music of lutes and harps. The castle, meant to unite, had become a wedge between ruler and ruled. And then there were the deaths. Unexplained, quiet, and always shrouded in rumor. Servants vanished without trace. Nobles fell ill after feasts and never recovered. Some whispered that poison lingered in the golden chalices. Others, that the very stones of the castle carried disease from the corpses buried beneath its foundations. Each death was explained away as accident or fate, but together they formed a tapestry of suspicion too large to ignore. The castle's grandeur had become inseparable from its shadow. No feast without a rumor, no banquet without a whisper of doom. Visitors who arrived in Oa often left in silence, speaking little of what they had seen. The beauty of the towers and the splendor of the halls lingered in their minds, but so too did the unease, the sense that something unnatural clung to the walls. The promise of glory was undeniable, but it was glory soaked in dread, a radiance that concealed a curse. The tragedy of the castle was that it succeeded in its purpose, but at a terrible cost. It did stand as a symbol of power. Its halls did dazzle foreign eyes. Its towers did proclaim strength to the world. Yet beneath every jewel lay fear, beneath every banquet lay whispers, and beneath every wall lay bones. The glory promised by the king was real, but it was glory bought with silence, fear, and death. The castle had become what its creator intended, a monument But it was not a monument to life, or to greatness, or to divine favor. It was a monument to arrogance, to ambition unchecked, to the suffering buried within its foundations. It gleamed in sunlight, but rotted in shadow, and those who lived within its walls knew the truth all too well. The castle did not promise safety or glory. It promised only death. From the outside, the castle stood as a marvel, a fortress of stone that proclaimed the strength of the kingdom. But for those who lived inside its walls, it was no symbol of security or grandeur. It was a prison. Its corridors whispered of despair. Its towers loomed like watchtowers over captives, and its walls did not protect. They suffocated. The promise of safety and glory gave way to a reality of confinement, paranoia, and unrelenting fear. Life within those walls was not the life of triumph that the king had promised. Instead, it was a daily negotiation with silence and suspicion. Servants moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled on the cold stone floors. Nobles walked with measured gestures, every glance carefully chosen. Every word weighed as though the very walls might repeat them to the wrong ears. The castle was not merely a structure. It was alive, and it demanded obedience. The architecture itself betrayed its true nature. The narrow windows let in slivers of light, but never enough to chase away the gloom. The air was perpetually cold, heavy with the dampness of stone that seemed to drink the warmth from every breath. At night, the wind howled through hidden cracks, twisting into a chorus that sounded almost like voices. Some swore they could hear the cries of those who had died during the castle's construction, their agony trapped forever in the foundations. The courtyards were vast but barren, their silence broken only by the occasional clang of weapons as guards drilled endlessly, a reminder that force was always watching. Beyond them, chambers stretched into labyrinths where one could lose themselves. And many did. Visitors spoke of the disorienting design of hallways that seemed to twist upon themselves, of doors that led nowhere, as if the castle had been designed to confuse, to trap, to erase. Servants bore the heaviest weight. They were the unseen lifeblood of the castle, carrying food, tending fires, scrubbing blood from stone after execution. Yet they were also the first to vanish when suspicion arose. Stories spread of servants disappearing in the night, their bunks left empty, their names never spoken again. The castle consumed them quietly, as though it required lives to sustain itself. For those who remained, survival meant silence. Never speak unless spoken to. Never look too long at a noble. Never whisper. For whispers were carried by unseen ears. Nobles fared little better. Though they sat at banquets, drank from golden chalices, and donned silk, their splendor was hollow. To fall from favor was to court death. Many lived in a state of constant vigilance, masking their true thoughts with forced smiles, feigning loyalty in a place where loyalty was never enough. They gathered in halls heavy with incense and music, but their eyes were always on one another, searching for betrayals that might already be in motion. The king's paranoia seeped into every stone of the castle. Guards doubled, then tripled, patrolling halls by torchlight, their armor clanging like a warning bell through the night. No one moved without permission. Locked doors and barred chambers turned the castle into a labyrinth of confinement. Even the highest lords felt the weight of chains without ever wearing them. And for the king himself, the walls he had raised to keep enemies out became the very barriers that trapped him within. Everyday life became a ritual of endurance. Meals were grand but joyless, conducted under the silent gaze of guards. Wine was poured, but every sip carried the question, was this cup poisoned? Music played, but every note seemed to ring false, a distraction from the suffocating air. Sleep was fleeting. Those who laid their heads down did so with the fear that they might not open their eyes again. Dreams, when they came, were filled with shadows that echoed the castle itself. Superstition thrived in this suffocating atmosphere. Servants left offerings in dark corners, small tokens of bread or wine meant to appease the restless spirits said to haunt the halls. Nobles clutched talismans under their robes, desperate to shield themselves from the whispers of curses. Even gods muttered prayers as they patrolled, their torches flickering against walls that seemed to pulse with life. The castle was not just stone. It was a living tomb. And everyone inside knew it. The oppression extended beyond fear of death. It gnawed at the mind, bending reality itself. Some nobles became reclusive, unable to endure the endless weight of suspicion. Others descended into madness, convinced that unseen eyes follow them at every turn. Servants who survived long enough grew hollow, their faces devoid of expression, their movements mechanical. The castle did not simply confine the body, it consumed the spirit. There were stories of entire wings abandoned after a string of deaths or disappearances. Doors locked and sealed, corridors left to dust, as though the castle itself rejected those who had dared dwell there. Yet the silence of those spaces was worse than the noise of the crowded halls. It was as if the walls remembered, as if the tragedies that unfolded within them seeped into the stone, staining it forever. The promise of glory that had once surrounded the castle now seemed laughable. The great fortress was less a symbol of strength than a mausoleum for the living. It displayed wealth but bred misery. It promised protection but delivered paranoia. It stood tall as a monument to power. Yet those who lived within its embrace lived shorter lives, marked by constant fear. Even foreign envoys who came dazzled by its towers and awed by its vast halls often left unsettled. They carried stories back to their lands, not of triumph, but of unease. They spoke of feasts where laughter was forced, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, of holes where silence pressed upon the chest until it became hard to breathe. They left with gifts of gold, but carried with them an understanding. This castle was no paradise. It was a trap, a place where life was drained behind walls that seemed eternal but felt like tombstones. The tragedy of the castle was that its greatest strength was also its greatest curse. Its walls were impenetrable, but they did not keep death out. They kept it in, circulating endlessly among those who lived inside. The fortress that had promised glory became a coffin for its inhabitants. Its towers reached for the heavens, but its halls sank deeper into despair. The castle suffocated not with chains or iron, but with silence, suspicion, and fear. It was a place where the living walked like the dead, where every step echoed with dread, and where every wall pressed in like the weight of a tomb. The dream of stone had become a nightmare, and those who dwelled within could not escape its grip. The castle had been promised as a fortress of protection and a symbol of prosperity. Yet once its gates closed upon those who lived within, the very walls that proclaimed glory became harbingers of ruin. Disease, hunger, and despair were the true rulers of the fortress, spreading silently through its chambers, consuming its people long before enemy armies ever threatened its gates. At first, the banquets dazzled. Tables buckled under the weight of roasted meats. Golden goblets brimmed with wine, and platters overflowed with bread and fruit. Nobles paraded through candlelit halls, convinced that the castle was the heart of abundance. But behind the spectacle, the truth was inescapable. The castle devoured resources faster than the kingdom could provide them. Villages emptied their stores to fill the larders. Farmers broke under endless demands, and the countryside starved so that the king's table could shine. The abundance was an illusion. Beneath the grand halls, in kitchens and storerooms, supplies dwindled. Rats scurried over sacks of grain, gnawing holes into the lifeblood of the household. Servants whispered of shortages, of meals stretched thinner each week, while the king demanded that his feasts remain as lavish as ever. Bread became stale, wine soured, and the meat that once arrived fresh began to rot in its barrels. Still, the banquets continued, a hollow show of prosperity masking the hunger, creeping through the castle's veins. With hunger came disease. The air within the castle was heavy, stagnant, and damp. Narrow windows allowed little ventilation, while waste collected in hidden corners, fouling the very ground the inhabitants walked upon. Water drawn from wells near the fortress tasted foul, tainted by the refuse that seeped into the soil. Sickness spread with terrifying speed. What began as a cough in the servants' quarters soon echoed through the noble halls. Fevers burned through the night, chills shook the strongest bodies, and lesions bloomed on skin that once shone with health. The physicians offered little more than rituals and superstition. Herbs were burned to cleanse the air, leeches applied to draw out imagined poisons, prayers whispered in hopes of divine intervention. None of it worked! The diseases thrived within the castle walls, feeding on the damp, the filth, and the despair. Corpses piled in hidden chambers, carried out at night to avoid disrupting the illusion of grandeur. Entire wings of the castle fell silent as their inhabitants succumbed. their chambers sealed and abandoned, leaving only the stench of decay behind. Hunger gnawed, even at the nobility.
While the king continued to demand excess, his courtiers were left with scraps.
Plates, once filled with abundance, now carried smaller and smaller portions. Wine diluted with water became the norm. Some nobles clung to appearances, raising toasts with empty smiles, while others whispered their complaints in secret, fearful that to voice their hunger would be seen as treason. The castle that was meant to project wealth became a theater of deprivation, its grandeur collapsing under the weight of empty stomachs. The despair was suffocating. Servants worked beyond endurance, staggered through corridors like specters, their eyes hollow, their bodies wasted. Guards patrolled less with authority than with desperation, many too weak to lift their weapons with pride. Nobles, confined to their chambers, fell into melancholy, their once vibrant lives drained of joy. The sound of laughter, once echoed in feasts, vanished from the halls, replaced by the persistent cough of the sick and the soft sobbing of the hopeless. Whispers spread of curses. Many believed the castle itself was rejecting those who inhabited it, punishing the arrogance that demanded it be built on blood. Some claimed the diseases were not natural, but sent by spirits of the dead buried beneath its foundations. At night, the wind carried sounds that seemed like wails, and the sick swore they saw figures standing at the edges of their vision, watching them with hollow eyes. Superstition merged with reality, and despair deepened into terror. The king refused to acknowledge the truth. To him, the castle was still the jewel of his reign, the symbol of power that would outlast his enemies. He demanded more banquets, more processions, more displays of grandeur, even as his people withered before his eyes. Those who dared speak of shortages or illness were silenced, dismissed, or executed for spreading fear. His obsession with glory blinded him to the reality that the walls he had built to preserve his name were instead becoming monuments to death.
The cost of his ambition was carved into every stone. For those trapped inside, escape was unthinkable.
The castle's gates rarely opened, and when they did, it was often only to carry out the dead. The walls that had been raised to defend against outside enemies now defended nothing but despair. To leave was to be branded a deserter, a traitor, and so the inhabitants endured, prisoners of ambition, their lives consumed by hunger and sickness. The cruelty of the castle lay in its contrast. Towers gleamed in the sunlight, banners waved proudly in the wind, and from a distance, it still seemed the embodiment of glory. But step inside, and one found suffocating air, foul water, empty larders, and endless suffering. The castle was both a beacon and a tomb, its grandeur inseparable from the misery it inflicted. The tragedies multiplied until they became impossible to conceal. Nobles collapsed during feasts, their cups slipping from lifeless fingers. Servants died at their posts, their bodies crumpled beside the fires they tended. Even the king, in all his arrogance, could not escape the sickness that stalked his halls. Whispers spread that his coughing fits grew worse at night, that his skin grew pale and waxy, that even he could no longer sleep without fear. The very fortress he had built to immortalize his reign had become the stage of his undoing. The lesson of the castle was clear to all who endured its walls. Grandeur cannot mask decay. Wealth cannot cure hunger. Power cannot shield against disease. The price of royal ambition was not measured in gold or stone, but in the lives crushed beneath them. The castle was no monument to glory. It was a mausoleum, built not for the living, but for the dead. And yet, even as death filled its chambers, the castle stood tall, its towers reaching into the heavens, proclaiming strength to the world outside. It was the cruelest irony that the very symbol of triumph was also the most terrible lie. For within those suffocating walls, the truth was undeniable. The castle did not give life, it took it. The castle had been built to protect, to serve as an impenetrable stronghold against the dangers of the outside world. Yet the most lethal threats came not from beyond its gates, but from within. The very walls that were meant to safeguard loyalty became breeding grounds for treachery. Conspiracies thrived in the shadows. Daggers glimmered in torchlight, and the blood spilled within its chambers was far more devastating than any enemy army could have achieved. From the beginning, suspicion ruled the castle. The king's paranoia infected everyone, turning court life into a theater of distrust. Nobles eyed one another across banquet tables, each wondering who had whispered poison into the king's ear.
Servants listened at doors and carried gossip from chamber to chamber, selling secrets for coin or protection. Even guards betrayed the very masters they swore to protect, their loyalties shifting with bribes, threats, or promises of survival. The castle was less a fortress of unity than a nest of vipers. Plots sprouted like weeds in the dark corners of its halls. Some aimed to seize power, others simply to survive. Nobles who felt slighted whispered of rebellion. Courtiers abandoned to suspicion plotted to eliminate rivals before suspicion turned on them. No one was innocent. For in a castle ruled by fear, survival demanded deception. A careless word, a delayed bow, or a glance at the wrong time could be taken as treason. To live meant to scheme. The walls that were supposed to shield the kingdom amplified the danger. Their very confinement intensified paranoia. There was no escape from whispered rumors, no distance from festering suspicion. Every corridor was an echo chamber, every chamber a potential trap. Betrayal flourished, not in spite of the castle's strength, but because of it. The higher the walls rose, the deeper the shadows grew inside. Blood was the inevitable result. Assassinations became part of life, carried out in ways both subtle and brutal. A cup of wine at a banquet might carry venom. A trusted guard's blade might slip between ribs in the quiet of a midnight patrol. Nobles vanished from their chambers, their absence explained away by fabricated tales of illness or sudden travel. In truth, their bodies often lay in shallow graves dug within the very grounds they once called home. But the conspiracies did not always stay hidden. When uncovered, they were punished with theatrical cruelty. Executions were staged in courtyards for all to see, a reminder that betrayal would not be tolerated. Heads adorned spikes at the gates, blood stained the very stones, meant to symbolize protection. Yet rather than discouraging plots, these spectacles only deepened the cycle. Each execution birthed new grudges. Each betrayal fueled another until the castle was consumed by its own violence. The king himself became the epicenter of this web of treachery. Surrounded by advisors he did not trust, served by attendants he suspected of spying, and protected by guards whose loyalty was never certain. He ruled in a constant state of siege. He demanded spies to watch his nobles, then spies to watch his spies, until no one knew who served whom. The court dissolved into a labyrinth of deceit, a place where truth was irrelevant and survival depended on how convincingly one could lie. Queens and consorts became both pawns and conspirators. Some were accused of plotting against the throne, whether guilty or not, and executed in acts of public humiliation. Others wielded their influence in whispers, manipulating alliances, orchestrating betrayals, and ensuring their rivals fell before they themselves could be accused. Marriage, already poisoned by politics, became another weapon in the arsenal of conspiracy. The royal bed was not a sanctuary, but another battlefield where loyalty and betrayal collided. Even the lowest servant was not free from the cycle. Many were forced into conspiracies against their will, threatened with torture if they refused, bribed with promises of survival if they complied. They became unwilling accomplices, carrying poisoned goblets, delivering secret messages, or unlocking doors for assassins in the night. Their hands were stained with blood, though often they lived just long enough to be silenced after the deed was done. The tragedy was that no one could claim innocence. The castle consumed all who entered, forcing even the purest of intentions into corruption. To remain loyal was to invite death. To betray was merely to postpone it. Life within the fortress was reduced to a game of survival, where the only rule was betrayal. The castle became infamous not for the enemies it kept at bay, but for the blood spilled within its walls. Travelers spoke of it as cursed, a place where stone itself seemed to thirst for violence. They said the walls absorbed the screams of the dying, the floors drank their blood, and the air carried the stench of deceit. To outsiders, it might have still appeared glorious. But those who knew its secrets understood the truth. The castle was rotting from within. The weight of conspiracies eventually infected the entire kingdom. Rival factions formed, each plotting to seize the throne, each whispering of alliances in hidden chambers. The king trusted no one, and in turn, no one trusted him. Alliances fractured, loyalty became impossible, and the line between friend and enemy blurred, until it no longer existed. Every noble family carried the stain of betrayal, every servant the memory of secrets passed in the dark. In the end, The conspiracies left scars deeper than any enemy's sword could have inflicted.
Families were annihilated, legacies erased, and bloodlines extinguished, not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of their own home. The castle, meant to be a fortress of protection, became the deadliest place in the realm. Its stones no longer symbolized strength but betrayal, each one laid upon a foundation of deceit. The lesson of those years was clear. The greatest threat to power does not come from beyond the walls, but from within them. A castle can keep out armies, but it cannot keep out ambition. It can repel invaders, but it cannot silence whispers. The same walls that defend also confine, turning suspicion into poison, ambition into bloodshed, and loyalty into a death sentence. The castle had promised glory. Instead, it became a monument to treachery. Its towers pierced the sky, but its foundations were drowned in blood. The very structure designed to protect a dynasty instead ensured its destruction, not by the hands of outsiders, but by the daggers of its own people. The castle had been built as a monument to strength, a fortress of glory meant to defy time itself. For years it loomed over the kingdom like a crown carved in stone, its towers gleaming in sunlight, its walls promising eternal safety. But what was designed as a sanctuary became a prison, and what was raised as a triumph ended as a tomb. The collapse of the castle was not a single moment of destruction, but a slow unraveling of everything it claimed to represent. The cracks were visible long before the walls fell. Hunger had hollowed its inhabitants. Disease had rotted its foundations. Conspiracies had poisoned its halls. Each tragedy was another stone loosened from the dream, another fracture in the illusion of permanence. The castle was dying long before anyone admitted it. Its walls still stood tall, but its soul was crumbling. By the time the final days arrived, despair ruled as surely as the king once had. The great halls, once filled with banquets, were silent and cold. Fires struggled to burn in the vast chimneys, their smoke mixing with the stench of rot that seeped from abandoned chambers. Guards patrolled without conviction, their armor loose on starving servants drifted like wraiths through the corridors, eyes empty, their movements mechanical, as though the castle itself had stolen their will. Whispers spread of omens that foretold the end. Some spoke of shadows moving without figures, of ghostly voices echoing at night. Others claimed to see blood seeping through the stones, as if the walls themselves were bleeding out the lives consumed within them. Whether superstition or truth, the sense was undeniable. The castle no longer belonged to the living. It had become a place of death. The king, once the embodiment of pride and ambition, became its most tragic prisoner. He locked himself deeper and deeper within his chambers. Surrounded by guards he no longer trusted, consumed by paranoia, he demanded reports of loyalty, ordered executions for imagined betrayals, and clung to his throne with a desperation that bordered on madness. His dream of immortality had turned against him, and the fortress he had built to enshrine his name was now his coffin. When famine struck with full force, the mask of grandeur collapsed. The feasts stopped. The wine ran dry. Nobles who had once strutted in silks now scavenged scraps like beggars. Some resorted to desperate acts. Theft, violence, even killing within the halls to survive another day. The walls that had once echoed with music and laughter now resounded with screams and the clang of steel in desperate brawls. Disease followed hunger, spreading faster than ever. Entire wings of the castle were abandoned, sealed to contain the sickness, though the effort was futile. Corpses were left to rot in darkened rooms. When there was no strength left to bury them, the castle became a labyrinth of death, each corridor leading to silence, each chamber a reminder of despair. Then came betrayal. As the king grew weaker, factions turned openly against one another. Nobles plotted not for the glory of the realm, but for their own survival. Guards abandoned posts, either fleeing or joining conspiracies to seize what little remained of power. Poison returned to goblets. Daggers flashed in corridors, and blood once again stained the stones. The castle no longer needed an external enemy. It devoured itself from within. Finally, the walls that had once been unshakable could no longer withstand the weight of neglect. Stones loosened, towers cracked, and roofs collapsed in storms that battered the fortress.
The great symbol of permanence revealed its fragility. What had taken decades to build began to crumble in mere months, as though the earth itself was reclaiming the arrogance that had defied it. Those who remained inside faced the inevitable truth. There was no escape. The gates, once symbols of defense, had rusted shut. The surrounding lands, ravaged and abandoned, offered no refuge. To leave was to wander into starvation. To stay was to await death within walls that now seemed to close tighter every day. The castle had fulfilled its prophecy, not as a fortress of glory, but as a tomb for those who believed in its promise. When the end came, it was not with a single roar, but with silence. Fires extinguished. Voices ceased. The halls stood empty, echoing only with the ghosts of those who had suffered there. The once proud towers crumbled into ruins, their stones swallowed by moss and earth. The dream of glory was erased, leaving only tragedy carved into the landscape. Travelers who passed the ruins in later years whispered of the curse that lingered. They claimed to hear screams carried on the wind, to see figures moving in shadowed windows, though no one lived there. Some said the ground itself wept, streams tinted red after heavy rains, as though the earth still bled from the countless lives lost within the fortress. The castle, even in death, remained what it had always been. A monument to ambition, suffering, and the futility of power. Its legacy was not glory, but warning. It proved that ambition built on blood could never endure. That no wall was high enough to protect against the consequences of arrogance. The castle stood tall. Yes, but it stood tall, only long enough to consume everything around it. When it fell, it left behind no triumph, no dynasty, no salvation. Only bones beneath stone, and a legend of horror whispered through the ages. And so, the story of the castle concludes not as a tale of majesty, but as a tragedy. Born of pride, sustained by suffering, destroyed by its own weight. It became a grave for all who believed in its false promise. Its towers reached for heaven, but its foundations sank into hell. And its ruins remain a silent reminder that glory bought with blood is never glory at all. The story of the castle is not one of glory, but of ruin. It was built as a monument to power, a fortress meant to outlast centuries, yet it devoured the very people who gave it life. Behind its glittering facade lay hunger, betrayal, despair, and death. Its walls stood tall against the world outside, but they could not protect against the poison growing within. The king dreamed of immortality, but what he created was a tomb. Every stone was paid for with blood, every tower haunted by whispers of the dying, every hall echoing with conspiracies that rotted the heart of his dynasty. What should have been a beacon of strength became a warning carved into the earth itself. Even in ruins, the castle still speaks. Its broken towers, its silent courtyards, and its moss-covered stones remind us of the cost of unchecked ambition. It promised eternity, but left only emptiness. It promised safety, but became a prison. It promised glory, but delivered tragedy. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the castle did not fall because of enemies outside its gates. It fell because of what was already inside. History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.